Okay, I think we're live. I'm actually not 100% sure, but I will continue assuming we are live. So welcome everybody. These things never start immediately on time. So let me wait another about 2-3 minutes so that people come, and then I'll introduce everybody. Okay. So we'll just wait another minute before we start with what should be a very exciting webinar. Hello, Caroline. Hi from Sunderland. Hi, Simone from Stirlingshire, and Nikki from London. Okay. And hi, Miranda from London. Always good to see Miranda. And Liam from Leicester. Okay, you can keep on introducing yourself if you like. So we've got a very exciting webinar today. It's looking at a report by Nina Robinson, who hopefully can turn on her camera now, and so everyone can see Nina. Nina Robinson is a recipient of the PIMID grant. PIMID grants are issued by the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity. The whole point of them is to give practitioners money to investigate an element of diversity in the media that they are close to, so that they can actually research the diversity and inclusion in that area. Nina is a recipient of that, and she looked at diversity in radio newsrooms, specifically looking at the BBC. Nina is a winner of numerous awards, including the prestigious Peabody Award. She has worked for BBC World Service. She's also won awards for the Foreign Press Association, and she was a senior broadcaster making documentaries in current affairs all over the world. So her report for the Lenny Henry Centre was looking at diversity in newsrooms. She will give a short presentation of the report that you can access now, but please do that after the webinar, on the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity. And while the presentation is going, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A section. We'll also, following Nina's presentation, we will then be having a brief webinar panel discussion with Mukti Jayan Campion, who I'll introduce later, and Bernard Achampong, who I'll also introduce later. We will then have a short period of about 20 minutes where we'll be able to take questions from people who are on the webinar. So, handing over to you, Nina, please. Would love to hear your presentation and of the report that was published today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Marcus. So I'm just going to share the presentation. Hopefully you can see that. So yeah, I was this recipient of this grant called the Practitioners Investigating Media Industry Diversity. It was a 3-month grant. I completed this research mainly in April and May of this year. And it's for media professionals. I am myself been working in BBC News and Current Affairs in radio for 17 plus years. I started off working in local radio. I had my first staff position at Radio 1 Newsbeat. I worked at 1 Extra News, and then I went to Jamaica as a sponsored reporter for a couple of years. And then when I returned, I joined the World Service at News and Current Affairs. And for the last 10 years, I've been making foreign news and current affairs documentaries. They included these programs from Japan. I've done a lot of work in India, In Jamaica, I was working on a documentary, an hour-long documentary on how music influences society. That's dance halls, Gaza Kim there. I actually did a 2-year project looking at the Olympic Games and its impact on a deprived community living nearby. And as Marcus mentioned, I have picked up a couple of awards along the way. The Peabody Award was for a programme I produced on the European migrant crisis. And there was a documentary that I made in Chicago on dogfighting. I actually left the BBC in December of 2020, and I set up my own media production company called Soundtruism. So that's just a little bit about me. About the research is specifically looking at the senior leaders in radio news and current affairs. So when I talk about senior leaders, I'm talking about those who are in a band E positions and above. So these are job titles, program editors like assistant editors, editors of programs, and also those senior leaders who have direct responsibility for news and current affairs. So these are the newsrooms, include all of the 40 local radio stations across the UK, Radio 1 Newsbeat, which also is across Asian Network and One Extra, like the Radio 4 Today programme. And also, crucially, involves World Service English news programmes only, so not the World Service language teams. So those are programmes like News Hour and Newsday. So what I did was I put together a research sample. I identified 118 individuals as my sample, and I went through them and identified that there were 7 people of colour who were senior leaders out of 118, which equates to about 6%. On top of that, I put in an FOI, Freedom of Information request, and I got 2 figures back. Those headline figures are 6%, which is the figure that came back for ethnic diversity at senior leader level for the UK nations, and the other one is 8% for news and current affairs division. So you're looking at about you're looking at between 6 to 8% ethnic diversity, and this compares to a BBC target, which is 20% currently that they're trying to achieve by 2023. And also it equates to what we're looking at with UK representation of ethnic minorities in the population of 14.5%. So this is quite below what you would expect. So how is that looking in terms of the other big finding was that in the UK nations, so this is BBC data for March 2021, with the existence of not only senior leadership teams, which were all white, but also whole newsrooms, which were white. So all white newsrooms. So if you can see the figures for BBC Radio Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland does not have a radio newsroom. They have a multi-platform team, but all the senior leaders working directly in that newsroom, programme editors are white, but also all of the journalists working in Radio News Scotland and Northern Ireland are also white. So these are staff journalists. And also the representation is also very low in Wales, only 4.9%. In addition to this, I also found the existence of an all-white newsroom, which was revealed by one of the research participants in the study, who said that there was a all-white newsroom in a very multicultural part of the UK. So this is a city which has over 40% ethnic diversity, and that newsroom, which covers that area, not only have a senior leadership team who is all white, but also a staff journalist team as well, which is an all white staff team. So the person who told me, the research participant, which was also backed up by other people who worked in that newsroom, said it was a black journalist, and she said that I'm the only person that pointed it out. She said, there are no black people working here. And the response from the white senior leader was, oh yeah, there aren't, are there? And then someone said, do you remember so-and-so? She added that there were 2 people of colour who both worked on temporary contracts, but they're not there anymore. Their contracts were not extended. And the journalist of colour actually concluded that she thought that the senior leaders were actually hiring in their own image. In terms of progress and how, what has been happening over time, in the BBC Inclusion Report 2020 to 23, they have a table which compares senior leaders for the whole organisation in the BBC. And from 2015, they have a figure of 9.2%, and in the 2020 box, they have a figure of 11.9%, which would indicate a 2.7% increase in all senior leaders across the BBC in ethnic diversity increase in that senior leadership category. But it has been noted that that figure is actually much smaller than that. Simon Albury, who heads the campaign for broadcasting equality, said that the senior ethnic diversity in leadership levels at the BBC increased by less than 1% in the 3 years from 2016 to 2019, when World Service figures are excluded. So a lot of the ethnic diversity figures for news and current affairs includes World Service language teams. And so obviously, by definition, those figures will boost up a lot of the numbers because the language teams are broadcasting in their own language. So Ofcom actually excludes World Service figures so that we get a better picture of the UK operation. So that's why I wanted to only include World Service English news teams rather than World Service languages. Whatever the situation in terms of how far it has actually, how slow the progress it has been over this time period, what is clear is that the BBC were aware of a particular problem of ethnic diversity at senior leadership levels in radio and newsrooms back in 2018. Tunde Ogungbesan, who is the then head of BBC Diversity, wrote in his report in 2018 that it was taking too long to see the change that is expected within the BBC workforce. And he recommended the development of a specific action plan which targeted those divisions with less than 10% ethnic representation, and which were showing poor employee survey results. And specifically that these divisions are mentioned of radio and newsrooms. And yet here we are 3 years on, and not very much seems to have changed. In addition to the data that I collected in the research, I also did a series of qualitative interviews. So these interviews were with 5 senior leaders. 3 of them were white, and I included those who were currently senior leaders and also some who had recently left in 2021. I thought it was important to include the perspective of the senior leaders who had recently left, because it meant that they were more free and reflective and be able to talk more freely about what they thought on certain issues. And also I included 3 journalists of colour in the qualitative interviews. And the reason for that was to look at the pipeline, the progression, what was actually happening in the newsrooms in terms of journalistic output as well. And we talked about many different things. The interviews ranged from 26 minutes to 1 hour. They were very in-depth. They went into a lot of different areas, but the two areas I'm going to just discuss with you now was the existence of a BBC type, which is groomed for management, and the other one is around recruitment practices. So a BBC type for senior leadership was mentioned by Tim Davie in his introductory speech when he took over as a Director General. And he said in his speech that he wanted to move away from this idea of a BBC type as a manager, and he wanted to senior leaders to stop hiring in their own image. But when I talked to the interviewees, the research participants, about who they think the BBC, what is the BBC type, they were very familiar in describing that person. And here are some of the words that were used to describe them. So somebody who talks a good talk, somebody who is outspoken and very forthright in their opinions, somebody who does not necessarily have any proper management skills or experience. And this came up a couple of times, that they felt that there was somebody that person should have some likability factor, that they were actually had some reputation that preceded them. And this phrase was also used, that the person should be of the correct cultural fit. And a lot of the interviewees equated these words to somebody who was white and who had received pronunciation, perhaps somebody who was part of the metropolitan elite. One of the journalists talked about the difficulty that they saw in terms of, the black journalist, one of the black journalists that I spoke to, talked about the difference between not being treated equally as the white counterparts. And they felt that their experiences in trying to progress into senior leadership positions meant that they had to show phenomenal kind of talent and experience, and that compared to white candidates who seemed to be able to progress for being mediocre. The recruitment process itself has been described by a white male senior leader. He said that it was whose face fits at the time. And he also, when he describing his own particular progression journey, said that a lot of it depended on who was on the board, who was on the interview panel. So if it was someone that you knew well, that did actually help you. And he also, one of the senior leaders of colour, she actually felt as well that there was this discrepancy between what you needed to show and demonstrate for progression as a person of colour compared to your white counterpart. And she said that there were people who didn't have degrees in management and leadership like I did. She said she saw people going ahead of her for years, and there was this sense that they had something that I didn't. She couldn't see what it was. So this came up within the research time and again, that senior leaders were hiring in their own image. And one of the white senior leaders who has herself been on many hiring panels and made a lot of hiring decisions, said that I've hired people and I think everybody has naturally their prejudices. I'm sure they do. She said, I do think some managers will look at people and think, can I get on with them or can't I get on with them? And usually that has to do with whether they like them or don't like them. And the senior leader of colour said that she had also had she had a lot of experience also on hiring panels, and had experienced that senior leaders design a task that plays to a person's strengths. And she said she had direct experience of this happening, where it was because they wanted to weed out everybody else. And she concluded that the recruitment process was completely skewed. The BBC inclusion plan for 2020-23 actually calls for a radical overhaul of the recruitment system, because their own staff surveys show the majority of staff are dissatisfied with the recruitment system. Some 2/3 of staff showed dissatisfaction with the current system of recruitment and progression. So I know that we're going to get into a bit more about solutions, but I just want to touch on some of the things that came out for the end of this report. And the BBC Inclusion Plan does call for a lot of action points around further leadership schemes to be in place. They also talk about having a thriving network. And as I said, they're looking to do a radical overhaul of the recruitment system. But some of the research participants actually noted some difficulties that had already happened with these. So actually three of the people had been on leadership schemes. One senior leader of colour, male, said that he'd been on a leadership scheme, and when, at the end of the scheme, he had spoken to the person in charge, saying, well, what does this mean? What is the currency of the scheme? And the manager had turned around and said that, well, he expected that perhaps 6% of the graduates of the scheme would end up getting jobs. And this is also echoed by another journalist who had been on a development leadership scheme and said that, it was a very good experience, but then there was a difficulty in actually getting the jobs. There was little ambition in actually trying to move those people into leadership positions at the end of it. And the journalist of colour that I spoke to said that the scheme had taught them that they would apply for jobs. If you can't get that job, then you need to pivot and apply for another job. And she said she did that and then ended up applying for jobs outside of the organisation and got the first job that she applied for because they thought that she was amazing, and ended up leaving the organisation for that reason. In terms of the networks, which are called to be kind of, wanting thriving networks, there exists a network for ethnic staff from Black and Asian and mixed heritage ethnicity backgrounds. It's called BBC Embraced. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be thriving because often there is very little engagement with those posts. Quite often there will be a post that goes up and it will get one like. But I just want to say that from my point of view, I would talk about the importance of getting the data and having transparency around the data, and also having senior leader oversight with the real consequences for poor performance. But also in the pursuit of diversity targets, there needs to be this thing called cultural competence in actually awarding, deciding who the people are that move forward into those progression roles. And they need to be people with the required qualifications and experience. One of the senior leaders actually said that he felt that there was little cultural competence, and sometimes people would be randomly chosen to just to tick the box and move those people in, and they would not necessarily be the right people for the job, which he felt was very damaging for the whole targets driven system. But I know that we're going to talk a bit more about that anyway in the discussion, aren't we, Marcus?
Yes, thank you, Nina. Thank you so much for an absolutely amazing report. Once again, we've had quite a few amazing reports through the PIMID scheme, where Lenny Henry Centre gives funds for practitioners to investigate diversity and inclusion in their particular area. But some of the stuff that you've talked about, I've been genuinely shocked. So I just want to ask you one or two questions before I bring in my the two other panelists. So I just wanted to clarify, when you talked about all white newsrooms, were you talking, because you're also talking about senior leadership at that point, are you saying they're all white newsrooms, or that the senior leadership was all white?
So there were senior leadership teams that were all white in certain UK nation newsrooms. So that would be Radio Newsroom in Scotland, and in Northern Ireland multi-platform team, and also in Wales, and also in this big city, which I'm not naming because I want to keep the anonymity of my research participants. So their senior leadership teams are white, but then in addition, there are certain teams like Scotland, Northern Ireland, and this big multicultural city, where also all of the staff journalists working on the team are also white. So they are all white newsrooms.
So I just want to clarify, because I find that quite shocking. So I just want to clarify that what you're saying is that in Wales, Newsroom, which is based in Cardiff with a non-white population of 15%, it's an all-white. Because I find that quite shocking. So I just want to clarify that what you're saying is that in Wales, Newsroom, which is based in Cardiff with a population of 15%, all-white. Because I find that. Okay, I don't know what happened there. Did you hear that question, Nina?
Can you just repeat it?
So we're saying that in a place like Cardiff, which has 15% non-white population, it's an all-white newsroom.
Yeah, that seems to be the case from the BBC data that was released.
And similarly, in the city, and I can only think of 3 cities that would fit this criteria, that has above 40% non-white population, their radio newsroom is non-white.
Yeah, so this was a snapshot that was taken when I did the research this year. And obviously there would be people on temporary contracts who might be passing through. But in terms of the staff positions in those newsrooms, those were the figures that were provided.
And then why did you, because the other thing which I just wanted to ask you about is that, so you excluded foreign language world service, but you included English language world service in your stats?
Yeah. So there was some debate a few years ago about how world service languages was included in the news and current affairs division for ethnic diversity figures, because obviously, that was accused of kind of inflating the figures, and that Ofcom actually do not include world service figures, but you're not able to separate the data in the BBC annual report. There was an argument that said that World Service actually does have a good UK audience, and that's why World Service was included in those figures. So I've compromised there, and I've said, well, if anybody is listening, UK people are listening to the World Service, they'll be listening to the English news and current affairs. So that's why I included those in my research sample.
Although the BBC, in receiving money from the Foreign Office, its remit is not to actually broadcast to the UK, which is, so it's specifically, just so people know, and I don't know if you knew this, they are actually told that they are not meant to target a UK audience in their English language as well. So that I find interesting, because I would assume if you're talking about English language, you're also talking about going to the Caribbean. You worked in Jamaica, you were saying at the beginning.
Yeah, that's right.
So that would have been people targeting, the World Service targeting the Caribbean and parts of Africa, I'd assume, because they're Anglophone. But so you included those?
Yeah, so I included news and current affairs programs that were broadcasting in English.
Okay, all right. So that's wonderful. And then the last bit, just before I bring in the 2 other panelists, is that one of the big issues I know is retention. And I know in your report you talk about retention. And so can you just briefly tell us what the issues are with retention? Because obviously BBC is recruiting, and I just want to know what's happening there.
Well, it's the figures seem to suggest, this is Ofcom figures. So Ofcom have said that it's concerning the amount of people of ethnic backgrounds, Black and Asian staff who are leaving the organisation. They said that in 2019, and they also said it in a report in 2021 that they felt that broadcasters seem to be looking at. They said they appear to have focused on entry-level recruitment at the expense of retaining diverse staff and enabling them to progress. And the BBC annual report has started to release the figures of ethnic diversity of people leaving. In 2016, it looked like there were 14.6% of staff that were leaving from Black, Asian and mixed heritage ethnicity backgrounds, which increased. So it came to an accelerating rate. It was accelerated in 2019 to 18.4%. And those figures seem to have come back to 14.6% in the latest annual report for 2020. at one point there was one year where it seemed to indicate that more people, more Black, Asian and mixed heritage ethnicity people were leaving the organization than joining it. But definitely it's not slowing down that rate. So it's not slowing down. And you would think, as Ofcom said, that that the emphasis should be to retain those diverse staff, because it's important to understand that the pipeline of talent. So if you're not looking to fill those positions at senior leadership level, you need to be able to have a good pipeline of mid-career and experienced staff to fill those positions later down the line. And so I actually asked my research participants to try to understand why it was, what was happening, why were they leaving. And there's probably like 3 points to say there. One is for the mental stress that people are under. So one of the few senior leaders of colour who left the organisation this year said that she'd had to actually go through a grievance process, which had labelled her as where she felt she had not been supported in a non-inclusive newsroom. And the result had been that she'd been labelled as an outsider, which for her, even though she'd been at the BBC for 15 years, for her related to her race. And also the mental stress, actually, of just having to keep on being a voice. One of the journalists of colour said that she felt that sometimes she was from being completely ignored in the newsroom to being a voice for all Black people. It carried a lot of mental stress, and that by the time that she got to mid-career, you were already too tired to carry on. That it become like so a cumulative effect. Then the other point is there is a certain cost associated. It's quite well documented that there is a cost of speaking up on racial issues, because you could say that you might be labelled like a troublemaker, or it could be that it signals a compromise of your impartiality. And then there's the other point about authenticity. So how much of yourself do you have to compromise to be able to progress to senior levels? And for people who, from Black and Asian, mixed heritage, ethnicity backgrounds, they might feel that they have to change themselves too much to be able to progress and be those senior leaders, to make that cultural fit, to actually, it's too much of a compromise to be able to have to make. And that could be another reason why they're leaving the organisation.
Well, at this point, I'd like to bring on the two other panelists. So if Mukti Jain Campion, thank you, and Bernard Achampong could turn on the cameras. Wonderful. So very briefly, I'll introduce Mukti. Mukti is the founder of the independent production company Culture-Wise. She has won more awards than I've had hot dinners, I suspect. I first came across her work for academia in a groundbreaking study that she did called Look Who's Talking, Cultural Diversity, Public Service, Broadcasting and the National Conversation. It is in many ways is the template for the Lenny Henry Centre of trying to marry academia and practitioner work. She has made numerous documentaries for BBC, including current affairs documentaries for television and radio, and as well as being chair of the Lenny Henry Centre, of the Sir Lenny Henry Centre. She's also sits on the Audio Content Fund panel, which looks at progressing and promoting content and that for documentaries and various forms of spoken word radio that otherwise might not be made by the marketplace. So we'll be coming to you in a minute, Mukti, after I've introduced Bernard Achampong. Bernard is also a multiple award-winning documentary maker, has worked at the BBC for over 15 years, is now CEO of Unedited, which makes numerous radio documentaries and podcasts. I think it's been going, I'm looking at you, Bernard, 2 years, 3 years, 2 years? 3 years. And in that short time has won also more awards, and it's gaining more commissions than I thought humanly possible, and is showing a different way in which you can forge and make documentaries and current affairs complement outside of the BBC, but also for the BBC. So very relevant to this. And I just thought, before we continue, just want to make it clear that we did invite the BBC to see if a representative could be on the panel. Unfortunately, Fran Unsworth said that she was unavailable, head of BBC News and Current Affairs, and the BBC were not able to send anybody, although I see that we do have some representatives from the BBC who have come to listen to the presentation. So that's very good. And we welcome, and if anybody, BBC or otherwise, would like to ask any questions, I'd encourage you to put those in the Q&A only chat. You can see on your in the right-hand column, on the third bar down, or third icon down, it says chat, and you have chat and you have Q&A. So it'd be great if people could put their questions in the Q&A that they might have for Nina about the report, or for Mukti or Bernard as the conversation continues. So my first question for Mukti, but I'll be coming to you, Bernard, is that, as I said, I found some of the stats in the report quite shocking. What's your initial reaction, Mukti, to the report?
My initial reaction is how disappointing that 15 years after my own report came out, which at the time, a lot of people at the BBC said was overly negative, that 15 years on, some of the quotes that you've heard from Nina are almost direct replicas of the quotes from the interviews that I conducted back in 2004, 2005. So that's the really depressing side of it. I think the positive side I'd like to take out of it is that there are more people talking about this now and actually looking for really practical solutions. And I think there are genuinely good people across the industry who really want to make things happen, but don't actually understand the levers to make the change happen. So there will always be a sort of, I don't know, a reluctance amongst some people to change that happens too fast, but you can't accuse anybody in this industry of that now. So let's start from here. Let's start with some of that shocking data that Nina has revealed. I have to say, before I carry on, please do look at her report, because one of the most striking things about it for me was seeing images of Black people in production teams. I just think that's something, it's an image that we so rarely actually see. So I applaud you for including those images, because if you don't see it, you can't be it. All that stuff is so important still. And what I think the beginning of this conversation really be about is, why do we care? Why do we care that there is not more diversity in production teams? The main reason we should care is because it affects the programs, the content, it affects the stories that we hear and see, it affects the perspectives that get platformed, and ultimately that affects the audiences and how much they trust the media who are producing this content. So all of that is the long game that we're playing, and that every single one of us in this industry should be playing. It should be about making the authentic, believable content for our audiences that makes them feel that they are part of this national conversation, that they are actually expecting to be represented and not alienated. So that's the bottom line for all of these conversations about diversity in production teams, in editor senior roles, all of that. It's not just about do-gooding. It's not about, oh, you know, I should feel charitable towards the poor Black people who are not in this production team. That's not the point of it. It really is about audiences and how we connect. So how do we change that? And I know that we probably all share the sense that it's not that difficult. Both Bernard and I have run production companies where I've made that my sort of private little social experiment. How difficult is it to find talented people from all different backgrounds as presenters, in terms of technical positions, in terms of producers, editors? Those people are there. They can get the experience and be as good as and better as anybody else. So it's not a shortage of talent. I think the BBC in particular has a problem with retention, and it's for a lot of the issues that your interviewees pointed out. I'm not going to take up too much more of this answering your question, because I know Bernard has very relevant points to add to that. But I would say it's not difficult. It's about having a focus and being proactive. And we've seen when the BBC in particular, but other broadcasters, have a determination to change the on-screen representation. In my lifetime, in my professional career, that has happened. When I joined the BBC in 1981, gender was a really big issue. That has changed. So these things are possible, but I don't want to wait 40 years to see the change in terms of, better representation of ethnicity, of disability, of people from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. Don't let it be 40 years. That's it for now anyway.
Bernard, what's your initial reactions to reading the report, hearing the presentation?
I can't honestly say I am shocked, not because I feel this is not an in-depth piece of work. My last stint with BBC News was in 2018. In that role, I had to pitch new digital formats and digital pilots to the news teams, and often in a room of senior leaders of 20-ish, I would either be the only black person of color, or I and another, the one person in those senior circles. And if you work in news, you know who they are. So that in itself doesn't surprise me. It's the state of play. This is how things are. And the researchers really just captured that for people who are outside those rooms to be able to see. I guess often you may think, if you work in news and you work in your team and your manager's white, it's probably better somewhere else. And when you see all the managers, senior leaders in a room together, and you realize actually they're more similar than different, you've got a slightly different view. So I don't feel it as a shock. What I do see is that this research is a gift to BBC Radio News. In all the changes that are happening with news and the partnerships and the window of creative competition and, schemes like Out of London and across the UK, BBC Radio News is a piece of the BBC that is pretty much internal. There's very little, subcontracting or partnering outside the team. So essentially, this is a gift to BBC Radio News. It's an internal challenge that actually you control all the moving parts. And I guess by heeding, maybe in a new way, the research that Nina's put together, it's an opportunity to make a change that's controllable within the members of the team.
So I just want to clarify what you're saying there, Bernard. So in terms of other parts of radio or compared to television, there's a lot more independent companies.
That's right.
Where it's harder to control who those independent companies employ. But you're saying that as far as you're aware, within BBC News and Current Affairs, it's a lot more internal, so they have a lot more control over the employment. Is that
BBC Radio News specifically is a lot more internal. I think across the BBC, you're looking at by 2025 in radio and audio, that includes BBC Sound, about 60% of the work being outside of London and a large proportion being supported by independent production companies. Radio News is pretty much intact. It's an internal challenge. It's an internal problem, if you like.
Okay. And so, Nina, when you were because BBC News is such a major player for non-white people who are working at BBC News, do they have options to go? I'm looking at Mukti and Bernard, who are both not working at the BBC, and you're not working at the BBC, but I'm curious as to what are the career options.
Well, it was interesting because when I spoke to some of the senior leaders currently in position, they would talk about the difficulty in trying to move people into those positions. So they would cite problems of, so redundancy, people at risk of redundancy, and having to choose from that pool of labour. And that was a restriction on their ability to, create diverse teams because the pool that they had to choose from was not diverse. That was one problem that they cited. And then the other one was that they just felt held back by internal processes in being able to kind of hire diverse teams. There was some talk as well that they couldn't find the people and that they weren't available, or there was one senior leader that said if they did find somebody who was good but not experienced enough, then they would drown in the job. So, you know, there were some difficulties that they said that they found in terms of internal processes to get the diversity onto the teams.
As Bernard or Mukti, feel free to jump in with this one. In terms of finding the talent, you both run production companies. Can you just explain some of the productions that you actually do, and where you find your talent or where you find your staff from?
Sure. So currently we're producing One Extra Talks, which is a current affairs program for One Extra, BBC, and we find our talent from around the piece. In the same way we ask around for who are good producers. We've worked on other projects where our producer was existing on the project, and we basically stepped him up from an AP to a producer and equipped him with the tools he needed. The current AP was working on a slightly different project in podcasting, and we found her, and she had an interest in news and current affairs, and we brought her in to that. I think the challenge with the BBC is once you're in, you're kind of bought into that tribe. Once you're in news, it's unlikely that you're going to move over to music or you're going to move into drama. So if your feeder, networks, for instance, Radio 1 Newsbeat, which feeds One Extra and Asia Network, if you're not getting that diverse talent through that door, and everywhere else is really challenging to get in, then it's very difficult to expect people to be able to move around, because you essentially just corralled into that same stream of the sector within the BBC.
Can I make a point about that? Radio news, current affairs, media in general is an extremely competitive industry, and sometimes newsrooms can be quite hostile places because of the level of ambition of people who are working there. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned at the start, but I meant to, that I'm from a working class background. My parents worked in factories. My dad worked at a newsagent. My dad had a newsagent for a while. But the big thing that happened to me, from a comprehensive school, I went to Oxford University, right? And that was the thing that opened doors for me. It gave me a huge amount of privilege when I was in that organisation. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I don't think I would have had the career that I had in that part of the BBC, making foreign news, if I didn't have that. So it's very competitive. But what came out of the research was that people of colour do not want to have any special favours. It's about that equality of opportunity, just to be treated the same. And that was the difference. And I think as journalists, you do have a very ingrained sense of what is justice, having this sense of injustice and fairness and fair play. And so that, if you don't see that around you just in that career progression, then that's something that, should be looked at.
Mukti, you mentioned that you first started work in 1981.
I know. I'm here to fill that particular diversity criteria.
Right. In terms of sourcing talent, and diverse talent more specifically, and racially diverse talent, has it become harder, easier? What do you think the challenges are, and how do you buy into when people say they can't find the talent?
I think you just need to know where to look. And I think there's so many people who are working in other areas of the media that could be brought into BBC newsrooms. But why would they? It's a sort of, you've got to make an attractive proposition. But there is no shortage of well-educated people who bring a lot of different sorts of social and life experience that we ought to have in those newsrooms. And it's how we know that jobs are being cut right now at the BBC. There are a lot of very good, experienced people leaving. I can see some of them on the Q&A line. So why is nobody at the BBC asking those questions? They're saying, why is this talent leaving? We need these people in the pipeline. How can we make it more attractive for them to stay and to see a career progression? It's not about lack of talent. That's never been a problem. I think it's just that sense of understanding. I think somebody called it cultural competence. In my report, I called it CQ, which is like EQ, emotional intelligence. You have cultural intelligence. That is as important as your journalistic skills, being able to connect with different audiences, have that appreciation of different sort of socioeconomic groups around Britain. All of that should be part of what makes you attractive to an employer. I don't think it is at the moment. And I think it is a lot of box ticking that goes on, and a lot of people who get put into positions where they're not supported, where they're not allowed to ask for help and support for fear of being seen as somehow, not belonging there in the first place. So those are the sort of really underlying things that people have to address. And we've heard a couple of comments about psychological trauma and the cumulative effect of that. It's certainly been an issue for everybody I know who's tried to work in media organizations. At some point, you start realizing that the change you thought was going to happen, around you is not happening. And if you become the person who sticks their head above the parapet and starts actually raising these issues in the workplace, you do get labeled, and you do get that sense of my days are numbered. And that can't be right. It shouldn't just be us, who recognize these things. It should be, in fact, if we go back to solutions, because it's very easy to keep going on about problems, I think one of the solutions is to make it the responsibility of everybody in a senior position to look at the people around them, who's working with them, and to challenge that in every way possible. Because a lot of us don't have the power. We can have power in our own little, production companies, or, as you said, I sit on the Audio Content Fund panel. I can raise some of these things, but actually the people who hire and recruit to their teams, they have the most, the biggest lever for change. Everybody should be looking around and saying, why does my production team not look more diverse? That's where the lever lies. And I would go as far as saying linking people's, annual bonuses and things to it. I think until there's actually a penalty for not doing this, it will not change. Everybody thinks somebody else is doing it. I think there's also a perception from my conversations that people think that there's been too much recruitment and too much box ticking going on. And there's almost a backlash against it within organisations, not just the BBC, but other media organisations. So we actually have to make it the responsibility of other people, not people of colour, not disabled people. It has to be anybody who's a manager or an editor, anybody in that, it's their job to be doing it. And we should challenge that at every single stage.
So Mukti, it's the first time I've heard you talk about tying bonuses to diversity. And I talk to you quite regularly, so I'll be coming back to you on that at some point. That's a very interesting idea. I want to go to the questions from the audience. So as this is for Nina, as you've spoken about the senior leadership, there's a really interesting question from Liam McCarthy. And Liam wants to know where editors of colour are in charge of local stations, Leicester and Leeds, has that made a difference? So if we're talking about solutions, is changing those kind of gatekeepers, does that make a difference?
Well, that certainly seems to have been the case. So when I look at the figures for Leicester, because there are actually two senior leaders, I think, there of colour, that is reflective of the news team. Because I remember thinking that when I was looking at Leicester, I was like, oh, that is like the one local radio station where there seems to be like more than one senior leader of colour, and there's some reflection in that in the news team. So definitely it seems to be having some impact, but that's not to say it doesn't always have to be. So one of the senior leaders, she's a white senior leader who also worked in a very diverse part of the UK, understood the value of having stories that reflected the local population. So she gave the example of if you had a big Bollywood movie opening in that city, then it was just as important as, or even more important than a pub shutting down, to be aware of that kind of cultural diversity of the area.
Okay. I'm just trying to race through the questions from the audience. Right, and so I've got a question from Simone Byrne, which talks about, I'm going to try and marry that with Mukti's approach about looking at solutions. And so the question is, do you feel it is structural? And at this stage in the game, do you feel it is a deliberate construct to control diverse narratives from a white perspective? So I'll ask Bernard about whether you think it's deliberate, but I also want to be solution orientated, as in if it is structural, are there structural things that we can do? Are there structural things that we should change?
Yeah, I think there's always the danger when you talk about problems and you talk about problems within the BBC and attitudes within the BBC. It's almost anonymized, you know. It's a big building, it's a brand, it's a logo. Who exactly are you feeling, you know, hurt by? Who exactly is positively progressing your career? For me, it always comes down to individuals. I think I'll echo Mukti's point about individual ownership and responsibility. For my career in news, working across World Service, working on the Radio 4 Today program, working in BBC Digital Pilots, I can name people individually: Stefan Mayo, Fiona Campbell, Ramesh Sharma, Jamie Angus. These are individual leaders who took steps into helping me make a change in my career or step up. And I think once we start to recognize who in the BBC, and we start to have that language, I think leaders will feel maybe a lot more empowered, if not less attacked, to make a change and break out of this systemic conversation of, well, it's so big, there's nothing I can do about it. I always like to quote the film Coming to America, where there's the scene in the car where King Jaffy Jaffa's wife he says to her, you know, who am I to change tradition? And she says to him, I thought you were the king. Well, let's look to the leaders in the organization right now to be the ones who make a change and work with individual members of staff rather than trying to say, well, I'm going to try and change this department to be 20% more. It's let's look at every single recruitment drive, every single development conversation, every single employee, whether full-time or part-time, who works in my team, and take responsibility for their development.
Mukti, the Audio Content Fund in a way is a structural intervention into the market. Are there structural things with regards to either finances or other parts of the BBC or just the general news, radio news ecosystem that you would advocate?
Yeah, perhaps not radio news, but radio generally. I think it's certainly a very interesting. I wish it'd been around when I was running sort of actor production company, because what it does, it gives you an alternative pathway.
The Audio Content Fund, this is.
Yes. So just for people who don't know, Audio Content Fund is a pilot project from DCMS, 3-year pilots, and we're into the 3rd year now, which offers money to production companies who have found a partnership with a commercial or community radio station for a project that they want to make. And the idea is that it supports public service content where the marketplace wouldn't in those particular sort of radio stations. So it's a very good lever, if you like, again, for production companies who may not be experienced ex-BBC people. It's bringing a lot of different people into the production sector, which I find quite exciting, because often it's sort of theatre companies or community groups who are initiating the content production. And, you know, it's still very early stages, but what it highlights is that some of the standard career pathways that people in radio were expected to take were largely dominated by the BBC. And particularly outside of news and music, if you wanted to make children's programs or documentaries or plays, you just had one place to go. Now there's more than one place, and hopefully the podcast sector in itself, which we haven't really talked about, is enabling all sorts of people to enter the audio profession without needing the stamp of approval from the BBC. And I think that will ultimately change the makeup of our industry in a really positive way. So yes, there are some really exciting things going on in our sector, and I think change will come not from the BBC only, it'll come from all these other areas where people aren't waiting for permission. I mean, we don't want to have, you know, these gatekeepers saying who can come in and who can, you know, stay. It should be a much broader power distribution, and I think we are beginning to see that.
Okay, we've had so much to talk about, and we've barely scratched the surface. I mean, as you just pointed out, Mukti, I think we mentioned podcasts twice, and the effect that that's obviously having on the market and will have effect on the BBC as well is going to be massive, and we are, as I said, we are hardly scratching the surface for what hopefully people will go back, read the report, and I'm also hoping that they will be inspired to apply for other PIMID grants from the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, so they can follow in Nina's footsteps as well. But I just wanted the last word from Nina. With regards to the report, where do you mentioned quite a few solutions in your report. If you could pick out just one, or I'll give you two, what would you love somebody the BBC or outside of the BBC to pick up on?
So one of the really good things that I saw was good practice is the PRS Music have started running a project which is like a network. So rather than looking at a network like a narrow kind of social media network like that kind of posts kind of, talks and things like that, this network is about putting together individuals, experienced professionals to support each other in the long term. It's like a 10-year project. And I think that's what I've heard from a lot of senior leaders that are not supported, or they don't, being moved into those positions. I think that there needs to be that kind of network where, they're all allowed to kind of help each other to get into those positions, and also help each other when they get into those positions. So I think that is lacking at the moment. That's a kind of structural network that could work. And the other thing is transparency of data, which I've already mentioned, needs to happen urgently. I mean, I should really not have had to write this report, because the information should be available. And then the other thing is just on doing better in terms of the recruitment. So I'm hoping that the radical overhaul that's been promised in the BBC Inclusion Report is not just skirting round the edges. Having an interview champion or a diverse person on the panel is not going to change that recruitment process, because our final decision is still resting with the hiring manager, with their their huge influence on that process. If you want a diverse panel, then you have to really make sure that you have experienced people who have an equal say in that hiring decision. So that these are some of the structural things that I think could be brought in.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. There's some really interesting conversations in the chat, things which I found out which I didn't know, especially with regards to Radio Leicester from Barney. Thank you, Barney, for giving me new information that I wasn't aware of, and also some really interesting stuff from Simone Byrne about Scotland as well. And I would encourage everybody to go to the Birmingham City University Lenny Henry Centre website, where they can download the report. The presentation, although excellent, really just scratch the surface. There is far more details. The interviews are really interesting and give such an important insight that the data and the stats, it just brings it all to life. And I would really recommend people to go on. And finally, once again, we are going to be opening up the grants. I think later on in 2022, we'll be obviously advertising when people can submit their application for those PIMID grants. But just looking at some of the attendees, there are lots of practitioners who are in the audience right now, this webinar. So please, try and apply for a PIMID grant. It's been this year has been an absolute highlight for the Lenny Henry Centre, where we've looked at radio diversity. We've had some brilliant stuff on disability. So we've had some brilliant stuff on gender and sound engineers as well. So some absolutely fabulous stuff. And I've missed out some of the PIMID grant recipients on some of those reports, so apologies for that. But please, some amazing work that's happening there. So thank you very much, Bernard. Thank you very much, Mukti. And Nina, once again, thank you for a very enlightening report. Okay. Goodbye, everybody. I was about to say good night, but it's still, it's just, I'm in Glasgow. It feels like night. It's overcast. But goodbye, everybody. And thank you, everyone, for attending. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.